December 14, 1944. Near the village of Kalterhof, Western Germany. Snow drifted sideways across the shattered farmland as the last echoes of artillery faded into the distance. Smoke lingered low and heavy over burned-out hedgerows. In the middle of the frozen field sat an American M4 Sherman tank, blackened by fire, its turret locked in place at a crooked angle. The tracks were buried in a mixture of ice, mud, and crushed stone. By every known rule of armor warfare, the tank should have been destroyed within minutes of contact. It was not. Witnesses from the German forward observation units later said it kept moving after the first direct hit, then after the second, then even after a third strike tore into its suspension. The tank had continued forward through machine gun fire and high explosive impacts, as if its steel had been briefly unplugged from reality. Hours later, German engineers arrived to inspect the wreck. And before the story continues, if these hidden moments of World War II history matter to you, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and comment where you are watching from around the world. These forgotten stories live because people like you keep them alive. The engineers did not approach the Sherman like a trophy. They advanced slowly, cautiously, as if the machine itself might still be aware of them. These men had examined Allied armor across France, Poland, Italy, and Russia. Burned engines no longer impressed them. Blown turrets no longer surprised them. But something about this tank was wrong in ways none of them could immediately explain. Its exterior damage made no sense. 3 confirmed armor-piercing strikes had penetrated known weak points. Internal fragmentation should have shredded the crew. Fuel vapor should have detonated. Hydraulic lines should have ignited. Yet none of the expected catastrophic failure patterns were present. Instead, the steel showed stress marks that suggested energy had been redirected rather than absorbed. The mystery was not on the surface. It waited inside. As darkness settled over the field, floodlights were positioned around the hull. The warm metal steamed faintly as cutting tools were brought forward. The first panel came free with a long metallic groan. No flames burst outward. No trapped pressure hissed loose. The inside of the tank revealed itself slowly, reluctantly. And within seconds, every engineer present realized they were no longer looking at a normal Sherman. The interior welds were wrong. They were not rushed. They were not brittle. They were layered in overlapping sequences that did not exist on any American schematics captured earlier in the war. Reinforcement ribs appeared where no structural need existed. Control housings were mounted against plates that were far thicker than doctrine required. One engineer traced a bead of alloy with his gloved finger and stopped. The steel beneath his touch felt doubled. They cut deeper. Behind the visible armor layer, hidden between stacked plates that were never supposed to coexist, they uncovered a sealed internal chamber running the length of the crew compartment. Inside it rested a narrow insert of metal unlike anything in German inventory. It reflected light without shine, matte yet luminous, as if the metal itself were awake under the floodlamps. No production facility in the Reich could manufacture something with that structure. For a brief moment, the engineers believed they had found the secret. They were wrong. The chamber was opened. Inside there was no device, no transmitter, no control system, no explosive, no weapon of any kind. There was only a message, stamped directly into the strange alloy in clean, flawless English lettering, were 6 words. "We know you will open this." The sound of tools stopped. An engineer took an involuntary step backward. No American crew could have survived the strike that destroyed this tank. The interior was crushed inward. Fire scarring crawled across the walls. Control levers were twisted into useless shapes. Yet the message had been placed here with complete confidence that German hands would one day find it. That meant the tank had not merely been designed to fight. It had been designed to be captured. Orders went out to Berlin within the hour. The mysterious alloy was declared a strategic priority. The wreck was to be transported under maximum security. The insert was to be extracted intact and delivered directly to Reich research divisions for immediate replication. The convoy was assembled before dawn. German High Command wanted the metal, but what they truly wanted was what the metal represented. If the Americans had solved something the Reich had not, it could alter every armored engagement on the eastern and western fronts. Yet the alloy refused to behave. Torch heat warped surrounding steel, but left the insert unchanged. Extreme cold fractured standard test plates, while the insert remained stable. Pressure tests caused conventional alloys to collapse at the grain level, while the mysterious material redistributed stress internally as though it could sense strain before it occurred. The more the engineers studied it, the more disturbing the results became. This was not simply advanced metallurgy. It was controlled metallurgy. Then the convoy vanished. 3 days after departure, Allied bombers struck the rail line near the Rhine during a pre-dawn strike. Bombs tore into the wagons carrying the Sherman remains. Fuel ignited. Ammunition detonated. Steel folded into itself as the train plunged into a ravine in a rain of fire and twisted metal. When recovery crews arrived hours later, there was almost nothing left to retrieve, except the absence. The strange alloy insert was gone. It had not melted. It had not shattered. It had not been located among the wreckage at all. The surrounding steel showed deformation patterns that suggested the insert had not been destroyed, but removed under forces that did not match explosive fragmentation. While German command struggled to explain the disappearance, British intelligence stations intercepted something far more disturbing. A short American transmission dated hours before the Sherman had ever entered combat. It referenced the exact German engineering unit that would later recover the tank. It listed their names. And at the bottom of the message, one final sentence appeared. Phase 2 depends on their curiosity. At that moment, the engineers ceased to be investigators. They became participants. And whatever Phase 2 was, it had already begun before the first shot of the battle had ever been fired. Because the Sherman had never been meant to win that fight. It had been meant to be opened. And whatever the Germans were truly meant to find inside that machine, it vanished before they ever reached Berlin. The metal was gone. The message remained. And the engineers now faced a realization that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They had not discovered a weapon. They had triggered a test. And they were no longer certain who was testing whom. The disappearance of the alloy set off a silent panic inside German High Command. Reports were locked behind sealed orders. Messages were delivered only by hand. Engineers were warned that speaking of the insert outside official channels would be treated as treason. Yet secrecy could not erase the truth that now spread through research circles like a quiet infection. Something had been taken, and no one could prove who took it. Interrogations began immediately. Every rail officer, every guard assigned to the convoy, every engineer who had touched the Sherman, each man gave the same answer. The insert had been present when the bombs fell. When the fires died, it was simply gone. No fragments, no residue, no impact scars matching forced extraction. It was as if the metal had chosen the moment of chaos to leave. And if this story already has your curiosity locked in, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files right now and comment where you are watching from. These are the stories history tried to erase. Within days, the German engineers were transferred under sealed orders to a research compound buried beneath a camouflaged industrial facility outside Magdeburg. There, they were given a new instruction: rebuild the alloy from memory. They were provided no samples, no fragments, only their own sketches and the fading images left behind in their minds. The work began immediately. Steel was refined. Nickel concentrations were adjusted. Chromium levels were altered. Rare trace elements were introduced in controlled ratios. Every attempt failed. Some samples collapsed under pressure. Others shattered under thermal stress. A few warped slowly on their own, without external force at all. No matter what combinations they tried, the structure never behaved the way the mysterious insert had. Weeks passed, then months. And with each failure, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The original insert had not merely resisted stress. It had distributed it. Every test showed that standard alloys absorbed force until their internal structure broke apart. The mysterious metal from the Sherman had done something entirely different. It redirected stress at the grain level, dispersing destructive energy laterally instead of vertically. This allowed it to survive conditions that should have obliterated it. It was not stronger. It was smarter. German command wanted answers. What formula had the Americans cracked? What mathematical structure governed the alloy? What production method made such internal behavior possible? No one could say. The insert was gone, and replication without a reference point was like decoding a language without an alphabet. Then something even more disturbing happened. One of the engineers who had first touched the insert collapsed during a late-night test cycle. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. Within minutes, he could no longer focus his vision. Within hours, he was dead. Doctors blamed chemical exposure, but no toxins could be identified. No contamination showed on his skin. No abnormal particles were found in his lungs. 2 days later, a second engineer fell ill. Then a third. Each had been present during the original opening of the Sherman. The deaths created a terror none of them would say out loud. The metal was gone, but something else might still be with them. And as the engineers struggled to understand what they had unleashed, if you believe these shadow stories of World War II deserve to be remembered, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and tell us where in the world you are watching from. History listens when you speak. Meanwhile, across the channel, British intelligence studied the intercepted message again and again. The sentence repeated inside analyst briefings like a poison riddle. Phase 2 depends on their curiosity. Curiosity had already occurred. That meant Phase 2 should already be in motion. Files from American research divisions were quietly cross-referenced with tank production logs. One obscure test program surfaced repeatedly under heavily redacted codenames. It did not focus on armor thickness. It did not focus on weapon power. It focused on survivability through misdirection. Engineers involved in the project were listed as having died in unrelated accidents over several years. Factory foremen vanished. Metallurgists were reassigned and never publicly recorded again. Even some test officers were quietly erased from formal service roles. Whatever the project had truly been, it had not ended with the Sherman. Back in Germany, paranoia spread through the research compound. Engineers slept in shifts. Guards doubled patrols. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now sealed with rotating access codes. At night, men reported hearing faint metallic vibrations pulsing through the facility walls. No machines were active during those hours. Nothing should have been running. And yet something was. One engineer began keeping a private journal, hidden behind a false wall in his sleeping quarters. In it, he wrote that the insert had not been a secret at all. It had been bait. He believed the true weapon was not the metal itself. It was the certainty that the Germans would try to understand it. If the Americans had anticipated curiosity, they had also anticipated replication attempts. That meant Phase 2 could not depend on success. It depended on effort. And that frightened him more than the idea of a hidden weapon ever could. Then the transmissions began. Encrypted radio chatter, with no identifiable source frequency, flooded monitoring stations across Western Germany. The signals carried no usable intelligence. They contained no coordinates, no attack warnings, no commands. They carried only short pulses and intervals that repeated in structured sequences. When analysts plotted those sequences against stress redistribution charts generated from the original alloy studies, the patterns overlapped almost perfectly. Whatever had been taken from the Sherman was still transmitting through behavior, not words. And if this moment made the hair on your neck rise, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files now and comment where you are watching from. This channel exists for the stories that refuse to die quietly. The engineers began to fear that their work was no longer being observed only by human eyes. Something about the pulses suggested feedback, as if responses were being measured in real time. Then came the arrest. Without explanation, one of the surviving Sherman engineers was removed from the facility in the early hours of the morning. No trial, no accusation, no paperwork. His quarters were emptied before breakfast. When his journal was discovered hidden in the wall days later, it had only one final sentence written on the last page. It is no longer waiting. From that point forward, the compound descended into unraveling silence. Orders stopped arriving. Guards were reassigned without notice. Some laboratories lost power for hours at a time without explanation. Every anomaly added to the sense that Phase 2 was unfolding without the need for German participation at all. And in quiet corners of the war that no battlefield map ever showed, men began to understand that whatever had truly been hidden inside that Sherman was never meant to be built. It was meant to evolve. And somewhere beyond bombed rail lines and sealed bunkers, something very old and very patient had already started the next step. By February of 1945, the research compound outside Magdeburg no longer resembled a facility of science. It had become a place of waiting. No further orders arrived from Berlin. No new materials were delivered. The guards who once patrolled its gates were rotated out without explanation. Some never returned. Others claimed reassignment that could not be verified. Inside the compound, the surviving engineers worked more slowly now, not because they lacked discipline, but because discipline itself had begun to fracture. Every new test ended in collapse. Every new alloy failed to echo the strange behavior of the missing insert. The guiding intelligence that once directed their work had vanished along with the metal. What remained was uncertainty. The radio pulses continued. Across monitoring stations in Western Germany, operators logged the same strange sequences. Short bursts, controlled intervals, patterns far too precise to be atmospheric. Analysts attempted to decode them as encrypted commands. Nothing translated. They attempted to classify them as long-range radar emissions. The frequencies did not match known systems. Then a new pattern appeared. The pulses began to shift. Intervals shortened. Power spiked briefly before collapsing again. It was as if the signal itself were learning through trial and repetition, adjusting its structure when earlier attempts failed. Whatever had been taken from the Sherman was no longer merely transmitting. It was adapting. In the final weeks before the Allied advance reached Magdeburg, fractured intelligence reports began circulating through both German and British channels. Convoys were arriving at experimental American testing grounds in Britain, carrying unidentified alloy remnants recovered from multiple battlefields. Shermans, half-tracks, even-downed aircraft. Each report described the same phenomenon. Thin metallic inserts discovered where none should exist. None identical. All untraceable. The realization struck too late. The Sherman in December had not been a singular device. It had been a prototype. On April 11, 1945, Allied troops entered the outskirts of Magdeburg. The research compound was abandoned. Laboratories stood dark. Papers were half-burned. Equipment lay scattered as if the evacuation had been rushed beyond reason. Of the engineers who had once filled its halls, fewer than half were ever located again. In the deepest underground chamber, behind a sealed blast door, investigators found one final test platform. It held no weapon, no alloy, no machinery at all. Only a metal base plate etched with 6 familiar English words. "We know you will open this." By then, the war was already lost for Germany. Berlin fell weeks later. Files were seized. Archives were cracked open. Yet nowhere in captured American research records did a completed explanation of Phase 2 ever appear. The program existed only in fragments. Short references inside layered projects. Budget lines without details. Engineer rosters with missing names. Test footage without corresponding design notes. Everything about it suggested intentional incompleteness, as if the real documentation had never been placed in any single archive to begin with. Years passed. Veterans returned to civilian life. Cities were rebuilt. The world turned forward. But in classified defense research circles, the questions surrounding stress redistribution metallurgy did not disappear. They multiplied. In the early 1950s, experimental American armor prototypes began demonstrating survivability well beyond theoretical limits. Aircraft structural components began dispersing fatigue in irregular patterns. Ships endured blast forces against hulls that should have fractured under lesser impact. Publicly, these advances were credited to steady engineering progress. Privately, researchers struggled to explain why so many of their breakthroughs followed mathematical models that no one could trace back to a single inventor. The ghost of the Sherman lingered inside their equations. Decades later, one surviving British analyst from the war years quietly admitted to a colleague that Phase 2 had likely never been a weapon at all. It had been a learning event, a seed buried in enemy curiosity, a way to force accelerated innovation through imitation and failure. The Americans had not hidden the alloy in the Sherman to preserve it. They had hidden it to remove it. They had allowed it to be found so it could be chased. The Germans had believed they were uncovering a secret. In reality, they had been helping to distribute one. And still, one question remained unanswered. During post-war psychological interviews, several German engineers independently reported the same recurring dream. Each saw the same metal surface. Each read the same 6 English words. And each heard a faint rhythmic pulse beneath the text, steady and patient. When asked what they believed the pulse represented, all gave the same answer. They said it felt like something waiting for a reply. Modern declassified files offer no conclusion. Phase 2 was never formally defined. No final report closed the project. No engineer ever claimed responsibility for completing it. Yet its aftermath can be traced across every modern battlefield design that followed. The Sherman had not changed the war by surviving longer than expected. It had changed the war by teaching the world how to think differently about survival itself. The tank was never the lesson. The reaction to the tank was. And somewhere between steel and curiosity, between secrecy and obsession, the real secret of that Sherman slipped into history and began rewriting it from the inside. And if stories like this remind you that the deepest battles of World War II were not always fought with guns and bombs, but with ideas buried inside steel, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and comment where you are watching from around the world. Your voice keeps these hidden histories alive.